You're listening to the Sea Change podcast, covering the trends and issues in Southeast Asia.
Hello all and welcome back to a new episode of the Sea Change podcast. My name is Nick Basson. Today's episode will feature Enda Ginting. Enda has held multiple roles both in the private and public sector in Indonesia. Most recently, he was the Indonesian country manager for Fortescue Future Industries. To begin our conversation today, Enda, it'd be fantastic to understand a bit more about your experience and background in the region and why you enjoy working in such a dynamic market.
Oh, thank you for that. I think a brief way to describe all that is basically I'm Indonesian and I grew up in Australia. So the last 22 years, my work has been all on reforming policies, and reforming business processes. And it started off pretty early with reforming the treasury systems, making sure they're not corrupt, and a progress on with the World Bank, which exposed me to a lot of variety of different sectors. And then the last gig I did in the public sector was with the President's Office, which put me in the pilot seat in the cockpit and actually see how much of these business processes needed to be adjusted to ensure that they can run quote unquote sophisticated policies. Now, what's important to see is that I've actually lived a life where the basic services do function. You pick up a phone call and you put a coin in, it actually does work. And buses arrive on time, health services, regardless of the public critique among Commonwealth nations, actually do work. So it was sort of hard and difficult. And then recently I took a turn in my profession by joining the private sector, leading a country portfolio of investing in producing renewable energy. And Indonesia is a key important country, not just regionally, but also globally, given its abundance. But again, Indonesia is Indonesia. There's never going to be a boring day. So, yeah.
Yeah, so how did you kind of find that transition from the public sector to private? Was it something that was difficult, or was it a fairly seamless transition? I know a lot of people say in Indonesia, private sector and government work closely. Do you kind of agree with that statement?
A very good question. I think I'd structure my response in three ways. One, I think in terms of the individual, the basic working skills are no different, so long as you've maintained that degree. Second, I think in terms of the general perception of satisfaction and value that you get, yes, there will be a huge transition if you're transitioning to just the conventional private sector. And I say conventional, as opposed to private sector, it's actually harnessing and ushering changes that affects public domain. So these are things that probably people crave and imagine they won't get if they jump into the private sector. But if you've chosen the right sector and the right entity to do so, you will get as much as these satisfactory values as working in the public sector. Lastly, I think the transition is actually important and made me relevant because of that, because something unique about Indonesia and most other Southeast Asian countries is that regardless of a business-to-business transaction, there is always a political nuance involved. So running the typical, all right, well, that's politics and here's private sector transaction is sort of not, is unheard of in Indonesia. And needless to say, I think rightly so, as a country that constantly is evolving in terms of the political dynamics in a very fast way, I think that's quite relevant. So the shortest way to describe point three is to say, well, Google can show you the maps of how to get around Jakarta, but it's actually much better if you know someone who knows how to use Google and also knows the back alleys, but relates to the common values of the global investment scheme. So good governance, transparency, no corruption is a must. And I think I confidently believe I fit those criteria. So the transition wasn't difficult because the passion and technicalities was there. And plus it was an Australian company, so it kind of reminded me of being back home. So that was great. Good opportunity.
Yeah, so we touched on a few key points there. Maybe a key word, transition, but not the context you mentioned. Maybe we get onto this energy transition here. What is the role of the private sector in the energy transition? Should they play a leading role? And where do you see the challenges for these private sector organisations We know Southeast Asia is a large energy consumer, which is expected to grow rapidly. Is it issues around access to technology, financing and so on? Where do you think the bottlenecks are?
This is a very tough question and a very good one. I think there's a combination of things where the private sector can play and also address the challenges. But an overall principle, I think my personal view, and I think a lot of other public sector practitioners see it this way, that innovation and ideas are always often generated by the private sector. And in a country, in an authority, in a public society where you have a lot of problems and some of these fundamentals are not fixed, you actually have, it is actually a good breeding ground for new opportunities such as financial services through Gojeks. And it's not that Gojek only works in Indonesia. I mean, any average Australian would probably benefit out of being able to walk home and order food and arrive food at the same time rather than waiting in a restaurant. But the problems are defined much clearer in countries like Indonesia. So to answer your question, I think the role of the private sector is to lead in energy transition. However, there is going to be a lag in the public discourse. As we are talking about renewable energy, no longer are we bounded by the conventional and orthodox way of managing energy. For instance, hydropowers, geothermal, solar PVs, and wind power. If you're running these investments in the conventional coal power scheme, then I think you've lost out on a lot of trade and a lot of opportunities. So there is a learning process between the private sector to be able to see how much of the targeted public sector authorities can actually progress up. That's I think the policy discourse lag that is happening. For instance, in Indonesia, the price of renewable energy is around, sourcing from hydro is around 5 to 7 cents kilowatt hour. As opposed to Singapore, where social energy from renewable is probably charged at around 22 to 27 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, you take a look that even the conventional energy, the fossil fuels, coal can be exported to Singapore from Indonesia, but you'll never find a transmission line built by an Indonesian entity to Singapore. Now, you take a look at the economics, it's actually cheaper to build a transition line because it's a one-time infrastructure. Now, this is where the renewable energy now opens a new domain on a lot of geopolitical questions and challenges. Are we going to let our entities sell 27 and earn 27 cents per kilowatt hour selling it to Singapore, and there'll be a carbon tax if we don't use it ourselves, and will they actually appreciate the 5 or 7 cents kilowatt hour? So this is the policy discourse lag, but the private sector should bring in the technology, the finance, and the know-how. But my suggestion to the private sector is have a humble appetite into investing into not just any Indonesia, but any developing Southeast Asian country, because there's a lot of learning that needs to be done for anyone, even for the general common Indonesians, because you want to come in that investments in a good governance for sustainable projects in the future. Therefore, you don't want to be raising red flags back home or whether your shareholders are vested interest in. And I think it's a step back to say, this is how much I know and these are the values I want to extend, but I need a lot of lessons learned. But clearly, in terms of finance and technology, that's where the private sector should come in. One more important thing, if you take a look at the Indonesian discourse on renewable energy, there's this hype about, we're transitioning into solar grids, solar PVs, hydro, and we're transitioning all of these combustion fuels into electric vehicles. Hang on, that isn't where the world at the moment, because you've got renewable energy for combustion off grids such as hydrogen, ammonia, and the authorities here look at it and like, what's that? So that novelty, they still haven't got a sense of how to regulate that. So the humbleness from the private sector should actually come in to say, all right, we want to invest, but we also want to hold your hand and make sure you can make these right decisions in a safe way.
Yeah, and coming from that private sector where they need to work with the government, hold their hands per se, if an Australian company is interested in getting involved in Indonesia, is it situations or setups where it's a JV with an Indonesian company in order to access that on-the-ground knowledge? How would you kind of explain that Australian private sector involvement in Indonesia? how can they create these mechanisms to work better, to understand the market they are working in?
Nick, this is the creme de la creme question. I think, look, the B20 event where Coordinating Minister Luhut sat, explained, spills out what it means to invest in Indonesia, meaning that no longer should we see Indonesia as a entry point, a target, or a source, but also part of the value chain, and we Indonesians do actually want to be part of the value chain. In line with the spirit of SDGs, that the people, the resources here are not treated as a commodity, but part of what we consider as a risk and return. Now, in doing so, there's a risk, because being involved in the entities in Indonesia means that you either do a JV or you serve a public interest. Now, I think there's a lot of desire and appetite to say, well, if we can just show export dollars, then that should be sufficient. Yeah, that probably is what Indonesia was like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, in the post-SDGs era, the appetite is there. The ability may not necessarily be there, meaning that I'll give you an analogy. I want to run with Usain Bolt, but I can't run as fast as him. Now, there's a very critical judgment to be made for investors coming from outside of Indonesia, particularly in Australia, that things are clearly going to be run the Indonesian way. But you still want to make sure some of these values that you have back home are still here. So my suggestion would be show that it serves a public interest, and regardless of how much quantity of public interest is being served, but so long as that can be displayed, then there's sustainability in the overall long-term investment. Secondly, keep in mind that in every single aspect, Indonesian entities would want to be part of the value chain. So it's not just awarding a contract, but how do you do that? You make sure that you maintain economics of investment. But when you do so, you do it for the long run. And I think this is where the SDGs value come in, very importantly, because no longer will we look at a partnership in a defined 5 or 10 years, but in a much longer term. Thirdly, I think my best advice would always refer back to understand the domain, understand the terrain, because there's never going to be satisfactory understanding. When it comes to comparing private and public sector, I think the Australian public sector has invested a lot in understanding how to operate in the Indonesian environment. Make use of that, because that to me would be like an analogy of a Lonely Planet or a Rough Guide's investment handbook to Indonesia, but then build on that. I think the common mistake any entity would do is, or even anyone from Indonesia, is to come into Australia and not read about what is it like living in Australia. Vice versa, coming in with Australian dollars investment without actually investing into the know-how is also a critical mistake. Now, I would conclude this part into saying, yes, you can enjoy, as a non-Indonesian, you can enjoy fried rice, which is a common staple food in Indonesia. It's actually very tasty, but you don't necessarily have to have it the way the Indonesians have it. Meaning that in a lot of Indonesians, you'll find their household would have fried rice for breakfast. And I'm sure most of my Australian friends in Australia will look at it, well, I'm not going to eat that for breakfast. I'll have my muesli. So learn how to enjoy it, and learn how to figure out when it's eaten, but also be honest about how it's going to be different to be tasted. And this is where the open and transparency of that mutual relation can actually be defined much clearer up front.
Yeah, when we talk about the relationship between Australia and Indonesia, what is the consensus about Australia, about Australian private companies in Indonesia? Is it something that's strongly viewed? I know Australia have very good business processes, high ESG standards, but are they a favoured partner for investment? We know the Chinese, they come in, they bring out the checkbook and things get done quickly. But how does that compare to Australian companies where the process might be a bit slower, might not have the same capital backing them as well?
Very, very good question. Let me structure my response in this way. I think if I was to talk to an Australian authority and I was given 25 minutes, I would want to hit hardcore logic first, and then get to the whole sympathies and empathies later. In Indonesia, it probably is a different sequence. You want to get to the empathy and sympathy first before the logics can come in. I think there's nothing specific about, in terms of the general perception about Australian investors, but I'd actually categorize it into those who know how to invest in Indonesia, and this is no different with how to know how to invest in Malaysia or Philippines, and those who don't. I think there is a group of a cohort of Indonesians who actually want some of these values represented by Australian entities, such as, respect for human rights, understanding indigenous rights and customs. And that's the appetite. However, little do the people realize that to do so, it takes changes in business processes. Therefore, the sequence and the pace of how things move are probably going to be very different as opposed to entities who don't even value these things. And we see that a lot coming in. So it depends on the ambition of the sector, who's driving these ambitions. I say so because you'll actually see in the last 2 years an increase in investment, real investment coming from particular countries who are notoriously perceived as no respect to human rights and the global values of humanity, as opposed to investments coming from entities who have a pretty high perceived credibility on humanity and ecological aspects. But this is not because the country or the sector favors one over the other, but in different sectors such as medical, you actually see that Australian investments coming in flourishing, excellent. Whereas when other sectors, depending on the drive, they may not be as welcoming as the health sector, for instance. So I think different sectors will have different views, a different pace and different drive. But there is a strong desire from domestic audience to want to have entities that relate and are responsible and are reliable towards these common values of humanities and respect of ecological impacts. That's the long run. How much of this appetite can be achieved depends on the readiness of each sector.
Yeah, and I guess country as well. We know we talk about this Southeast Asian podcast. Where else are the opportunities for Australian businesses in Southeast Asia for renewable energies? Obviously, we've kind of started this conversation focused on Indonesia, but is there any other markets out there which you think are really interesting or prosperous going forward and need that extra bit of investment and time, that long-term horizon, such as in Indonesia? Or is there somewhere more suitable to go straight away?
Look, I think Australian entities by all means are known to be leading and excelling in a lot of the energy transition, the technology, the know-how, access to finance, credibility. Now, if you take a look at Southeast Asia, just the ASEAN region, you have a majority, around 99% of net producers of renewable energy, and only a 1% nation as net user. And this is notably Singapore and certain parts of, let's say, Laos or Cambodia, who actually do not have access to renewable energy. So you take a look at wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal. By all of these portfolio, Indonesia sits as the largest producer. So even in terms of hydro, the so-called rivers here, untapped. Geothermal, it has the highest level amount of active volcanic mountains. Wind, probably some other countries probably have better. And solar PVs, the irradiation is probably much lower in Indonesia. But in the overall portfolio, Indonesia will be the largest. And you've got countries like Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, Vietnam and Philippines are also quite high up there. Now, entering these markets, each would have a very different thing. It's like, one is risotto and one is biryani. You give risotto to someone who eats biryani, their common perception will say the rice is not cooked and it's hard. And this is how dissimilar and similar the authorities and the cultures of investment. So I think the question goes back to the private sector. Where do you think your expertise fit well the most? And where do you think you have access to the know-how of how to navigate an investment in permits and legal aspects of a particular country more? Because that defines how big and how fast you can enter the market. And given that there's not much competition, to be honest, because Australia is one of the leading Western countries and modern advanced countries in the region. There's actually an easy access, and there's a lot of the proximity does change the entire environment a lot, as opposed to investments coming in from Europe or Middle East or South Central, Northern America, who would probably look at India, Southeast Asian market as a portfolio, but not something that comes into the appetite. So, so that's how I would actually address that question, Nick.
When we talk about all these solar, wind, and so on, obviously we need critical minerals as inputs to this. One interesting fact, a solar farm requires 3 times the critical minerals of the same size coal power plant. Where are these critical minerals going to come from? We're seeing prices being extremely high, the market's susceptible to manipulation. Are we producing enough critical minerals? There's opportunities for not only producing them in Australia, but also processing offshore, but also integrating that in Australia. How do we increase this acceleration of supply of critical minerals?
Very, very good question. I think this is the global debate on the energy transition, other than finance and then access to critical minerals. Look, two things. One thing to note is that while there is a huge discrepancy on labor costs, there is also a lot of opportunities for a circular method of economy into processing minerals, meaning that where are these minerals already being used and how do we harvest the best out of them, out of the existing? Now, this brings us discussion to the critical mass. And the critical mass always comes into how much of the labor resources actually does one particular country has a competitive advantage over the other. Secondly, I think, and by all means, all of these 2 points are under the assumption that all of these access to critical minerals, whether it's recycling or new mining, is needed and unavoidable. Given that there's the new energy transition and new requirements for doing so. Again, it puts Indonesia, the second point, it puts Indonesia back in the chart, because you have a lot of these here as critical minerals, but even if you are obeying through the environmental management legislation of a particular country, Indonesia still is up there, because this country mines a lot of its minerals, and unfortunately, a lot of the tailings get thrown into the rivers and end up in estuaries and the oceans. Now, in the world of renewable energy, these tailings, for instance, silica, that's contained in any conventional mining, is actually a precious commodity in renewables, and the value chain and the whole concept of it is envisioned but not yet defined and charted, because no one's yet able to construct the cost of labor, cost of manufacturing, cost of shipping. But if you take a look at any slag report on any mining or any tailings in Indonesia, around 99.99% of everything there is needed for renewable energy. So a good start would look like, all right, just take all of these mining tailings, because it's destructing the environment, work on that, and then build as a stepping stone. So the principal morale here is to not come into and dump in $60 billion, but start gradually. So 2 things. 1, you don't come across as a very hungry giant, and 2, you actually let the authorities learn how to regulate and legislate your investments as you progress and grow. Now, in the end of the day, you might look at it and say, well, some other investors from other countries are already mining it from virgin sources. Well, that's yes, and that's how it is. But as the world is growing better to understanding how traceability of all these resources, you may ask for the global value chain may already be asking for credibility, sustainability certification, which you would definitely pass, because you are actually cleaning up destructive elements to the environment. So there is humbleness into the appetite, but reputation is needed. So you can't come in and say, well, I'm a new guy, new coming in, this is what I'm going to do. No. Build that, because I actually see a lot of entities coming from East Asia actually invest into the credibility before they actually start growing big. It doesn't mean that they don't have the appetite to grow big, but they know there's a pace that they need to keep up with and make sure that their government counterparts can grow, because if they grow, then that allows the private sector investments to also grow. So that's my overall view, and all of that concludes to, well, Indonesia is a very important country, and being part of it means investing into understanding how to work in Indonesia, how to survive in Indonesia, but to an extent that you are able to be honest to say, I've understood, but this is how far I can go. Because as much as tasty as a fried rice, I'm pretty sure average Australians would not want to have it for breakfast.
Yeah, so we talk about Australian businesses coming into Indonesia, but even a young guy myself, I'm looking to establish a career not only in Indonesia but throughout Southeast Asia. We see declining Indonesian language rates in Australia. What kind of tips would you give for Australians going to these different markets? Is it get a really strong base in language, which then lets you learn more about the culture? Or is it okay not to speak the language and still understand the different customs and so on and work through that channel? What kind of advice would you give for a young person looking to establish themselves in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia more broadly?
Very good question. Very good question. Look, I'm not going to make this a very tough part for anyone wanting to learn about different cultures, because I also had the opportunity to have to learn different culture as we were moving to Australia back then. I think you need a bridge. Anyone needs a bridge, either through a language or access to a culture. But also keep in mind that the cultures and the society that you are entering are also evolving. So what may come across as okay 10 years ago may also change. So a bridge will always allow you to have a spot in learning how things work, how the norms go, how the general consensus is accepted. But more importantly, it allows you to have access into the thinking behind or the rationale behind certain behaviors. And this is important. Now, it was no different when my parents took me to Australia, and they didn't have a bridge because they spoke English, but they couldn't relate to the English spoken in Australia, and we were that bridge. I actually remember my father going to a bait and tackle shop, and he goes, ask the guy who's been super friendly to him, and he goes, what's up, blah, 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 and the guy goes, what's that? And then all of a sudden that commercial goes on TV, and apparently my dad was quoting Bumper Bar. And to me, that depicts that, he doesn't have a bridge. He didn't build it because he came with a family of 4 and we grew into a family of 5, and he had to do a PhD and also all these. But for any young person moving to different cultures, regardless of how similar they look, because I come to Philippines and I look, they look like me, but we're totally different cultures. The ability to say, okay, how do I establish that bridge? Do I start befriending people who speak English or has lived into my life, and then slowly work my way, or do I actually try to learn a general language? And this is where language is always the easiest option, because it allows you to look into how people put a cultural value to a different use of word. But having said that, Indonesia and a lot of other countries have exoticness, just like how Western Australians are quite similar and different to New South Wales. You don't want to invest in too much, because therefore your time is spent too much on investing and learning rather than actually enjoying. Given that 700 different languages in this culture, and I just take a general consensus, but also be open to say into what that Indonesian looks very different to the other Indonesian. Say, okay, well, here's that exoticness. So, because look, every 1.6 kilometer in this country, there's a totally different language. That's going to make anyone who wants to learn about Indonesia say, it's such a daunting task. And I don't want to discourage that. So a bridge is always great because it allows you to constantly develop. Now, my Australian colleagues and mates look at me and say, you talk Australian in pre-1995 and the post-1995, you don't know the lingos. Yes, that's absolutely very true, and I've taken that for granted. So I've also taken that, I knew about Australia everything until 1995. Which is wrong, because I go there now and there's new lingos that I've been exposed to. Not because these lingos are new, but at the time, at my age, these were not things that I've been exposed to. Now, it's the same as coming to Indonesia or any other Southeast Asian country. There will always be involved. So it's not to take away that daunting task mindset. Language is always great. Just one, and then gradually build an understanding from there. But also keep in mind that culture is also going to be evolving.
Yeah, that thing about evolving cultures, I think you kind of puts to home that you need to spend time in these countries. You need to go back continually. You need to learn language, contemporary language. It changes over time. You can't go, I've done Indonesian 10 years ago. I can go back into that market. I've learned Vietnamese 10 years ago. I can go back into that market. It's an enduring effort. It's a long-term horizon. You're not going to get the quick wins overnight. So I think that is really hitting home to me here. Kind of one last question. It's a big one, but hydrogen in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of shipping lanes through Southeast Asia. We're talking about Indonesia, Maritime Fulcrum. Is there a possibility of them powering hydrogen ships, taking loads to Europe? Where is hydrogen in Southeast Asia? Is it plausible? Is it economic? Will it happen? I know it's a huge question here.
Look, anecdotally, since you asked this question, I'll go ahead and say, in a lot of the authorities' mindset, hydrogen is still something they studied back in high school when they studied basic chemistry. But we talk about hydrogen and the need for it. One, for some of the energy that they need to replace, it should be a quick bet. However, we found the ability to break down a vision of a world with hydrogen. You need other safety measures, such as not the greenest hydrogen, but a stepping stone towards green hydrogen. But also the second part, which is as important, that if you have a vision of a world of hydrogen, you need to extend that visionary thought that for offtake. At the moment, everyone's envisioning offtake as Europe, but more and more authorities around the world are now looking at it, well, I'm not going to sell stuff to Europe because I won't let them buy my critical minerals or buy my resources. And then in 10 years' time, they're going to start campaigning around the world, oh, we've done so great, but, sourcing all of that stuff from other countries. This is where everyone's coming to a realization that if you've taken the use of hydrogen as a vision in a particular country, also vision that the domestic offtakes, while it also serves the public interest, it can grow economically. So in terms of the economies, it's economical to produce hydrogen in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, given the maritime nature of the countries. And vessels and ships in the maritime world are probably a lot more excelling than other mobility sectors such as aeroplanes. There are already vessels that can take ammonia as fuel. There are already technologies that allow transport and shipments. But again, regardless of the economies, it is still an authority that you look at it and say, how do I get the economical price? For instance, the market price for renewable energy coming from hydro in Indonesia is around 7 cents. Now, if it's in a scale, you can probably bring it to 5 cents at a negotiated price. Well, what if I want 2 cents? Well, you got to have a political price. And to do that, you got to invest in the political bridge. Now, being honest about this is important, but the ability to say, I don't know about this is much more important, because then you're able to chart how much resource you spend into negotiating, because there's no point negotiating from 7 cents to 2 cents when you're negotiating from a market price and you're bypassing a negotiated price and you're going straight to political price, but you haven't built the political bridge. That political bridge could come into a form of JV, so long as it's aligned with good governance and ABC values in Australia entities. Or it could come into just making sure you're serving a public interest and there's support from the local legislators, the national legislators. So hydrogen is a big thing in the region. Unfortunately, the policy discourses haven't reached the maturity level of some OECD countries, even the quote-unquote maturity. But this is a region that can produce, because there's a lot of water around and all you need to just get rid of the salts and minerals and voila. But if there is a bit of a dilemma, because it can only be economical in the long run if you come in at a particular scale of investment. Now, you may not want to get that at the first day of operations, which is no worries, so long as you can just say, there's a pathway for me to say, I'm going to be producing, let's say, 20 or 30 gigawatts of hydrogen sourced from renewable energy in a particular country, but for the first year, it's probably just going to be 400 or 600. That stepping stone is much more important, because it allows you to grow, it allows you to build credibility, and it allows you to come back to your shareholders and say, there's the economy in this, and it's because of that, it's at scale. At the moment, what you actually see is two Indonesian state-owned enterprise, state power company, PLN, and Pertamina, not yet there in terms of one source of renewable energy may be used for grid power and may be used for non-grid power for combustion. That thinking is not yet updated. So they still think into, everything that is grid belongs to the state power company, PLN. Everything non-grid, which is oil and gas and whatever they're going to be used to replace that, belongs to Pertamina. That's the 70s and 80s and 90s model, which is a very good example to show to evidence that leads into it. Yeah, the legislators, the authorities, the domestic market is not yet up to date. Hence, any investor would need to upgrade people's understanding, enlighten them, but also at the same time build that credibility and trust.
Yeah, I love how all of this is coming back to having the relationships, working with government, upskilling them also. I think that's a really key part of it. It's not you can just go plant your money in a particular country and that's it, you're done. It's the process, it's the long term, it's the effort that you're putting in. It takes time, all these investments. It's always a classic tale. It's not overnight. So I think today has really hit that home. There's been a lot of interesting points talked about. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been fantastic to hear your opinions, get your insight. Definitely one of the leading minds on the energy transition in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's been a great pleasure sharing. And I'm telling you, I'm not sharing insight. I'm just sharing what life in Indonesia is all about. But that analogy makes perfect sense. For me to come into another ethnic group's hometown, I can't build a wall and say, this is where I'm going to, if I got to, mingle, unless it's going to be urban life in Surabaya where no one cares where I'm ethnically from. But if I'm going to live in rural Indonesia, like in Papua, everyone's going to know, what's your surname? And we are different. So, but look, hopefully this has been helpful and it's been great sharing thoughts. I think it's not just targeted to the Australian audience, but I think to generally also the Indonesian audience, given how plural and how insular Indonesians are towards one another. So great, happy to share anything I know, mate.